I would think that this is David being on the next level of righteous. Like I would read this story and think, David, wow. I mean, here's the thing. As you read about the stories of David, this guy's a killer. I mean, God said, you're not going to build my temple because you have killed so many people. It's not like David's afraid of killing people. But here is his chance to kill his one enemy more than anybody else, who is keeping him from being in the spot that God told him he was supposed to be. And he said, no, I'm not going to do that. It kind of throws you into a spiral, doesn't it? Throws me into a little bit of a spiral. Let me show you a couple things here as you think about your comments that you want to make on this. Let's see, where's the verse? Verse 4, 24 and verse 4. The men of David said to him, here is the day of which the Lord said to you, behold, I will give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as it shall seem good to you. And later when you read the same stuff, David said to Saul, the Lord gave you into my hand. Have you ever heard that story? It's a faith and action story. It's a made up thing about a guy who is in a house when it's flooding and the floodwaters are coming up, and he prays to God, God save me. And not too long after that, a man comes by in a boat and says, hop in the boat. And he said, no, I don't need to do that because I prayed to God and God's going to save me. And floodwaters came up. The story goes on, and he climbs on the roof, and then a helicopter flies by, and they say, get on. And he says, no, I prayed to God, and God's going to save me. And the floodwaters come, and the man gets swept away and dies. And he's standing before God, and he says, God, I prayed to you, and I asked you to save me. Why didn't you save me? And God says, I sent you a boat and a helicopter. What else do you need from me? And that's a story that means a lot to us in life. We don't just pray and do nothing. We pray and we do. But when I read this story, here's David with the shot that he's been waiting for, and he says, it is not right to stick out my hand against the Lord's anointed. Yeah, Jim. Yeah. He found his limit. He found the line. Look at this too. I think it's verses 5 and 6. Afterward, David's heart struck him because he had cut off the corner of Saul's robe. I mean, that's something. Ryan, when I think about the righteous level in David's heart here, like, I'm patting myself on the back if I'm David right now saying, here he was in front of me asleep and I didn't kill him. David felt guilty for making the point. Verse 6, he said to his men, in my Bible, I tell you sometimes about highlighting. Blue is when you pay attention to a word in my color stuff. So here's some blue for you. So David persuaded his men with these words and did not permit them to attack Saul. David persuaded his men. If you have a New King James Version, it says David restrained his men. If you have an NIV, it says David sharply rebuked his men. The New Revised Standard Version says David scolded his men severely. But here's the word. I did a right click on my Bible software to look for the word. That word is the same word in the Old Testament laws about what you can eat and what you can't eat if you're a Jew, and it talks about you can't eat anything with a cloven hoof. That's the word. David persuaded his men. It's the same word that is basically tear. Other times the word is used as separate or tear. And the idea here is, you know, David's not the only one running for his life. Everybody else in that cave is with him. And they're ready to end it right now. And David says no. He says no. He tears them away from this situation and says, this is not something that we're going to do. And maybe, I'm just a terrible person in the room as I think about this, but I can't say that I would do the same. I mean, that's why I'm talking about this is the hardest lesson in this whole series that we put together. And here is his rationale. I think these are the keys. Verses 12 and 15. If you do something to mark a key point in your text, it's probably going to be verses 12 and 15. May the Lord judge between me and you. May the Lord avenge me against you, but my hand shall not be against you. Here, David is willing to sit back and say, if God wants to take care of you, then God can take care of you, but I'm not going to do it. Verse 15. May the Lord therefore judge and give sentence between me and you, and see to it and plead my cause and deliver me from your hand. I'll give David an awfully hard time later on especially. But if this is the level of faith that characterizes what it means to be a man after God's own heart, then this is something that we can aspire to. To have this level of faith and say, if God will take care of it when he's ready to take care of it, for now I'll just keep running for my life. Yeah. How many people, though, could you rationalize? He's not technically God's anointed anymore. I'm pretty sure I could put my head in that spot if I were David. But, I just think so much of him after reading this story. And Abigail's next. The gospel meeting, but maybe a week from now, I think, is the next time. We've got another one coming up. So maybe in a moment of holiness in your life, you managed to do the right thing once. Would you be on the run for your life a second time, be in this exact same situation again, even more desperate to survive, with even more people who are ready to take care of this situation, and do the right thing twice? So that's going to be chapter 28. Wait a second. I want to make sure that I didn't miss any of my notes. We'll see if I can remember to do Philippians 1 after this one. 26. Sorry. Okay, let's read it. I listened to an audio Bible so I could try and get some of these names right. There's a lot of hard names in this section, so be patient with me, please. Then the Ziphites came to Saul in Gibeah, saying, Is not David hiding himself on the hill of Hachilah, which is on the east of Jeshimon? So Saul arose and went down to the wilderness of Ziph with 3,000 chosen men of Israel to seek David in the wilderness of Ziph. And Saul encamped on the hill of Hachilah, which is beside the road on the east of Jeshimon. But David remained in the wilderness. When he saw that Saul came after him into the wilderness, David sent out spies and learned that Saul had indeed come. Then David rose and came to the place where Saul had encamped. And David saw the place where Saul lay with Abner the son of Ner, the commander of his army. Saul was laying within the encampment while the army was encamped around him. Then David said to Ahimelech the Hittite and to Joab's brother Abishai, I'm just going to call him Abishai because that's what I've always done. I can't do it the way that I listen to. Abishai the son of Zeruiah, who will go down with me to the camp of Saul? And Abishai said, I will go down with you. So David and Abishai went down to the army by night, and there lay Saul sleeping within the encampment, with his spear stuck in the ground at his head, and Abner and the army lay around him. Then Abishai said to David, God has given your enemy into your hand this day. Now please let me pin him to the earth with one stroke of the spear. I will not strike him twice. So there it is again. You see that? Here is another person who says, David, It could not be more obvious that God has given us this victory and put this in our path. It's right here. Verse 9, David said to Abishai, "Do not destroy him, for who can put out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless?" And David said, "As the Lord lives, the Lord will strike him." Listen to this. This is, if you're going to mark, so there's a handful of different lessons in each of these different things. David says, "I'm innocent. I haven't done anything in all this thing. I will not stick out my hand against the Lord's anointed." But one of the lessons is the idea of, to quote from Deuteronomy 32, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay, thus says the Lord." That vengeance belongs to God. Listen to the way that David talks about how vengeance is God's. Verse 10, David said, "As the Lord lives," number one, either the Lord will strike him, or his day will come to die, or he will go down into battle and perish. "The Lord forbid that I should put out my hand against the Lord's anointed. But take now the spear that is at his head and the jar of water, and let us go." So David took the spear and the jar of water from Saul's head, and they went away. No man saw it or knew it, nor did any awake, for they were all asleep, because a deep sleep from the Lord had fallen upon them. Then David went over to the other side, and this is where they have a conversation. David says, "Hey, here I was again." And Saul says, "Uh-oh." And there's more. It's a little baffling to me too when I read this story, because it seems like Saul has, at least in 24 and 26, it seems like Saul has some moments of clarity. Maybe being this far away from death is enough to make a person realize, oh, yeah, this guy really is God's chosen one. What do you think on this one? It's basically the same story, but what do you think? Comments about what we're reading here? Yeah. Over and over again, too. I mean, this is not the first time that he's acted like this. Yeah, do you think, I mean, how many of you, though, because this is what's hard to me when I read this passage. I am 1,000%, more than 1,000%. I promise you, I would be the guy standing next to David saying, "What's wrong with you? Like, God doesn't open a door any wider than this right now." And everybody's talking about, God has, remember, I just keep repeating, I can't believe it. God has told David, "You're the next king. Here's the open door. The door doesn't get any opener." And David says, "It's not the right thing to do. I'm going to wait for God to take care of this." I'm going to read this real quick. Philippians 1 in verses 9 through 11. This is a passage that kept coming to mind. I've got two more examples that are, if you can even imagine it, maybe even more outlandish than the first two that we've already talked about. But this is a good pausing point here to talk about this. In Philippians 1 and verse 9, Paul says, "It is my prayer that your love may abound more and more with knowledge and all discernment." That's why I keep coming here. Paul says he's praying for the Philippians that they might have more and more love and be able to know and discern, which seems to me to be David's key quality in this. He can see clearly where other people can't in this. That you might have more and more love with knowledge and discernment, so that you may approve what is excellent, and so be pure and blameless for the day of Christ, filled with the fruit of righteousness that comes through Jesus Christ to the glory and praise of God. Over and over again, I think this was true for me doing police work, but it's even more true for me in my role as a preacher. The thing that I think I crave more than anything else is just to know what the right thing to do is. And this text scares me, because I promise you that I would have been on the wrong end of that stick. Number 3, thank you for comments on this. 2 Samuel chapter 1. I might need to summarize some of this. What's the clock look like? I think we're all right. So, we're not going to take the time to do this, but if you flip left one page, 1 Samuel 31, Saul kills himself. He sees that he's lost, falls on his sword. You might read 2 Samuel 1 and verses 1 through 16 and say, wait a second, there's a conflict in the text. So I'm just getting ahead of this now. I think here's my take on this text. I think this Amalekite is a liar. I think he's saying something that he thinks is good to try and win favor in David's sight. Just in case that happens to cross your mind, that's what I think is going on here. But, verse 1. After the death of Saul, when David had returned from striking down the Amalekites, David remained 2 days in Ziklag. And on the third day, behold, a man came from Saul's camp with his clothes torn and dirt on his head. And when he came to David, he fell to the ground and paid homage. And David said to him, where do you come from? And he said, I have escaped from the camp of Israel. And David said to him, how did it go? Tell me. And he answered, the people have fled from battle, and so many of the people have fallen and are dead. And Saul and his son Jonathan are also dead. Then David said to the young man who told him, how do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead? And the young man who told him said, by chance I happened to be on Mount Gilboa, and there was Saul leaning on his spear, and behold, the chariots and the horsemen were close upon him. And when he looked behind him, he saw me and called to me, and I answered, here I am. And he said to me, who are you? And I answered him, I am an Amalekite. And he said to me, stand beside me and kill me, for anguish has seized me, and yet my life still lingers. So I stood beside him and killed him, because I was sure that he could not live after he had fallen. And I took the crown that was on his head and the armlet that was on his arm, and I brought them here to my Lord. So then David gets upset because Jonathan was his best friend. Upset about Saul too. Verse 13. David said to the young man who told him, where do you come from? And he said, I am the son of a sojourner in Amalekite. And David said to him, how is it that you were not afraid to put out your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? Now you're that guy. Let's say he's telling the truth. Saul fell on his spear and didn't get the job done. And this guy's telling the truth, and Saul said, hey, would you finish it for me? Or let's say that he's lying and he's telling David, you know, this is the story. Saul told me to do this thing. And how does your stomach fall to the floor when David says, who do you think you are to kill the Lord's anointed? Then David called one of the young men and said, go execute him. And he struck him down so that he died. And David said to him, your blood be on your head, for your own mouth has testified against you, saying, I have killed the Lord's anointed. So, David said, maybe God will take care of this in battle. It kind of looks like that's what he did. And then David gets on to the person who says that he did God's will to kill Saul, and now David's going to be king. And this is the thing that's pointing me to this whole lesson. It's pointing me to this thing. The idea of the person that God has placed in this spot. How dare David or anybody else raise up their hand against them? It seems to be an indisputable fact at this point. I mean, I don't know. I want to argue about this way more than any of you, probably. But I keep coming back to this spot. Then there's one more. You can comments on this before I go to the last one? There's one more, Ryan.
Just a technicality Bible question. Are you anointed forever?
Kind of seems like it.
Is that a common theme? Like, does that have implications for like our anointing in Christ? That's where I'm going.
See, so this is the thing that I wonder about. Maybe you're not anointed forever. I don't know, maybe. But when you go back to what we talked about last week, I think it was 1 Samuel 16 and verse 5 and 6, that the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David in verse 6, and the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and a harmful spirit entered into him. I would be inclined to say there's where he lost his anointing. But David apparently didn't see it that way. So I don't really know the answer to your question. So look at this. In chapter 2 then, Saul is dead. And then in verse 8, we're not going to read this. Saul has a son who's still alive. His name is Ishbosheth. Ishbosheth becomes king now of Israel. So now what we have is David is king over Judah. That happened in chapter 2. We'll talk about this more in the later class. David is king over Judah, over one tribe, and Ishbosheth is king over everything else. Okay? And so then you come to chapter 4. And this is the wildest one of all, in my opinion. Chapter 4 and verse 1. When Ishbosheth, Saul's son, heard that Abner had died at Hebron, his courage failed, and all Israel was dismayed. Now Saul's son had 2 men who were captains of raiding bands. The name of the one was Baanah, and the name of the other was Rechab, the sons of Rimmon, the man of Benjamin from Beeroth. For Beeroth is counterpart of Benjamin. The Beerothites fled at Gittim, and have been sojourners there to this day. Jonathan, the son of Saul, let's skip down to verse 5. Now the sons of Rimmon, the Beerothite, Rechab and Baanah, set out, and about the heat of the day they came to the house of Ishbosheth, as he was taking his noonday rest. And they came into the midst of the house as if to get wheat, and they stabbed him in the stomach. Then Rechab and Baanah, his brother, escaped. So these guys are like military personnel for Ishbosheth, who is Saul's son, the king of Israel now. And they revolt against their king. Verse 7. When they came into the house, as he lay on his bed, in his bedroom, they struck him and put him to death and beheaded him. They took his head and went by the way of the Arabah all night, and brought the head of Ishbosheth to David at Hebron. And they said to the king, "Here is the head of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, your enemy, who sought your life. The Lord has avenged my lord the king this day on Saul and on his offspring." There it is again. Every one of these stories has somebody saying, look at what God has done. Look at what God has given you, David. It's clear as day. In verse 10, and when one told me, "Behold, Saul is dead." Oh, wait. Where am I? I lost my spot. I'm in verse 8. "Here's the head of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, your enemy, who sought your life. The Lord has avenged my lord the king this day on Saul and on his offspring." But David answered Rechab and Baanah, his brother, and the sons of Rimmon the Beerothite, "As the Lord lives, who has redeemed my life out of every adversity, when one told me, 'Behold, Saul is dead,' and thought he was bringing good news, I seized him and killed him at Ziklag, which was the reward I gave him for his news. How much more when wicked men have killed a righteous man," "have killed a righteous man in his own house on his bed, shall I not now require his blood at your hand and destroy you from the earth?" And David commanded his young men and killed them and cut off their hands and feet and hanged them beside the pool at Hebron. But they took the head of Ishbosheth and buried it in the tomb of Abner. So here's something I want you to notice about the text. Saul died in chapter 2. David becomes king over Judah, but Ishbosheth is king. And now Ishbosheth is killed in chapter 4. Look at the very next thing that happens in chapter 5. This is where David becomes, this is the official spot. 2 Samuel 5. This is the spot where David becomes the king over all Israel. So you might imagine that this was a positive thing that happened. I mean, both of these things. Saul died, boom, king over Judah. Ishbosheth died, boom. Now here is the fullness of God's promise. David is king. And David punished all three of the people who said that they made that happen because they raised up their hand against the Lord's anointed. What do you think? See what I was texting you about today? This is tough stuff. I mean, it's hard for me to wrap my head around the whole thing. Here's a couple things. Mark already read this one for us. Submission, acknowledgement of, and submission to the one that God has appointed. Romans 13 and verse 1. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. That's probably worth connecting to our thought. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. It's probably also a good idea to remember that at the time that Paul wrote this, the Roman government actively persecuted Christianity, and he still says what he says. So, submission to what God has established. And then Proverbs 20 and verse 22. I'm sorry that I haven't left a ton of space for talking. If you have some comments, I'll just read this one passage and then I'll stop. Proverbs 20 and verse 22. There's a lot of this in the Bible. You know there's a ton of this in the Bible, but this is one proverb. It's one short little verse, easy to read. Do not say, I will repay evil. Wait for the Lord, and he will deliver you. And it kind of reminds you about a lot of the stuff that Jesus said too, right? Yeah. But he was convinced about what was right, and that's what he was going to do. I think that that's probably it's time to ring the bell. I don't know if somebody already did or not, but Tim, would you do that just in case they haven't? This is one of the things that I have to keep saying to myself, especially in this lesson. When we do Bible study and we read the Bible, we don't seek for affirmation for what we already believe and justification for what we want to be true. We read what God has said, and then we form our hearts and our lives around that. And now you have a project. Now you have work to do. At least I do. So may God help us to identify what Paul said. With all knowledge and discernment, what is the right thing to do? And then just relentlessly pursue that right thing at all cost, even to our own peril. So thanks for, I didn't let you participate much tonight, but if it was in your mind, thanks for thinking about it.